This segment gets more specific in describing the components of grand strategy. This discussion is meant to provide you with some benchmarks by which they can be differentiated. Now remember that grand strategy is the set of overarching ideas or principles that structure and provide the political, economic, or moral rationale for a more specific set of foreign policies that the United States might implement. While necessarily abstract, grand strategy tends to be concrete enough to come in several identifiable varieties and forms. Over the next 2 modules, we're going to discuss 7 alternative versions or visions of grand strategy, including isolationism, offshore balancing, selective engagement, liberal internationalism, primacy, liberal hegemony, and restraint. Did I say restraint?
Yeah, now you did.
All right. So one thing to remember about grand strategies is that they are best understood in relation to one another, as relative rather than absolute positions. One is more or less isolationist, and this may mean different things during different time periods. Now, grand strategies are going to vary along several different dimensions, generally, interests, threats, and means. Now, the first way to differentiate them is to think about how they define the scope and content of American national interests. These are the policy goals that the U.S. pursues in its relationships with other governments around the world. Here you might think about how expansive American interests are. Are they global? In other words, do political developments in far-off places like in India, Pakistan, or Syria influence the ability of the government of the United States to protect its citizenry? Or instead, are American interests more limited geographically, focused, say, on what's happening in North America? Now, grand strategies also differ in terms of the content of the national interests or the policy goals that the U.S. pursues. For example, after the Cold War, the U.S. embraced the goal of promoting democracy in other countries around the world. During the Cold War, this goal was subordinate to the larger goal of containing Soviet power and the expansion of communist influence. Now, the content of American interest is also often linked to how the principal threats in the international system are conceptualized or defined. This is our second distinction among grand strategies. This definition of threats generally includes specifying the scope of the threat, whether it's narrow, as isolationists often view it, or expansive and global, as the other grand strategies in varying degrees tend to see outside threats. Defining threats also includes specifying the identity of that threat, that is, the identity of the threatening state, group of states, or transnational organization like a terrorist group. Now, this identity is important because it helps to define the interests or political goals of that threat. For example, central threats for the so-called war on terror have been Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These organizations have sought broadly to pressure the United States from withdrawing some of its military forces in the Middle East by conducting terrorist operations against those troops in the region and against the American homeland. Now, third, grand strategies also differ in the means or political instruments they employ to achieve the desired political goals that they're trying to accomplish. For example, grand strategies can differ in the degree to which they rely on international cooperation to achieve their ends. Some grand strategies may prefer to rely on limited cooperation, namely a set of unilateral policies that preserve American freedom of action to meet its goals. Alternatively, more multilateral grand strategies may instead share the responsibility for defining threats and implementing policies with other governments or international organizations. For example, when the United States builds a coalition to fight a war, say in Afghanistan or Iraq, this is an example of a multilateral policy. Now, grand strategies also differ in the types of means they employ. For example, some grand strategies are more willing to employ hard or military power to achieve their desired ends. Competing grand strategies can push back against this dependence on military solutions, emphasizing the value instead of diplomacy, economic statecraft, or perhaps doing nothing. Now, in sum, when you're trying to differentiate among different grand strategies, ask yourself how you can separate them in terms of defining national interests, how they differ in defining the principal threats to those interests, and how they differ in their most preferred policy instruments or means to achieve those national interests.
Now, the rest of this module and the next module will present 7 examples of different grand strategy possibilities that have been part of larger foreign policy debates about America's role in the world in the post-Cold War era. Now, these grand strategy options include isolationism, offshore balancing, restraint, selective engagement, liberal internationalism, liberal hegemony, and primacy. And you can array these grand strategy options along a continuum that helps you see which grand strategies are close to each other and which ones are extremely different from each other. Now note that there is some overlap among these grand strategies. You're going to read about how restraint is a mix of isolationism, offshore balancing, and selective engagement. You'll also read that liberal hegemony is a mix of liberal internationalism and primacy. This continuum is going to help you visualize the relationship and differences among these grand strategies. And this continuum is probably set by 2 key characteristics. The first is the geographic scope of American interests. As we move to the right of this continuum, these grand strategies are more likely to hold that the U.S. has interests all over the world. They're global interests. In other words, primacy would hold that the outcome of the Syrian civil war has implications for the global distribution of power, so the U.S. should be involved there. Alternatively, an isolationist would hold that potential military intervention in distant places is a trap. The U.S. needs to stay focused on what happens in North America. Consequently, the U.S. should not be involved in Syria.
Can we show the graphic again? Just to re-summarize, yep. So if we're on the far right of this, we're thinking about the United States has global interests. This means that the U.S. cares about what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in South Asia, in India and Pakistan. As we move to the left on this and we move towards isolationists, they are going to define the scope of American national interests more narrowly or more regionally. And so they're going to say that the United States should be focusing on what's happening in North America and should be focusing on domestic nation building and making sure that American workers have jobs, right? And so the scope of national interests are defined more narrowly as we move here to the left on this continuum.
Right, and so that's a key differentiating aspect of these global strategies or grand strategies. So that's one way of looking at it, more narrow interests versus more global interests. Second, we can also distinguish these grand strategies according to their willingness to deploy American military power in support of U.S. foreign policy interests. As we move to the right of this spectrum, the grand strategies will be more willing to use military force to achieve the national interest. So let's put up the continuum again. So as you can see, as you move to the right, under primacy in particular, there will be more willingness to use military force. Thus, grand strategies associated with primacy will argue that the United States should build up its military power and use it when necessary to achieve American interests. Isolationists, on the other hand, are skeptical of such claims and say that high levels of military spending is wasteful because the U.S. already has geographic assets like large oceans on its eastern and western borders that make a military invasion of the United States from Asia or Europe very difficult.